So we will be talking about the Suicide Prevention Day, which is on 10th of September.
Yes.
And I watched your video with Tony. You mentioned that you did some training with his restaurants or bars, clubs. He mentioned some experience of his friends committing suicide. So tell me, what's the work that you do for businesses?
Yeah, so my little bit around what I guess We Are Hummingbird is and the way we work. I myself experienced a mental illness, which was quite a turn of events for me and changed my whole life. So my background's actually corporate insurance. I spent 17 years working in corporate insurance, working in a business environment in the centre of London. And although I worked in that industry, that wasn't who I was as a person, if that makes sense. I like to go to Ibiza. I like to go to live music events. I live a very different lifestyle to the lifestyle that I had when I worked. Yeah. And when I was experiencing my own mental ill health, I quickly realized that there was no organization out there that spoke to me. Whilst there's loads and loads of great mental health organizations, there's none that spoke to me in my language or in a way that I understood or the way that I could relate to. And that's kind of where all of this started. It made me realize that if I can't relate to these organizations, there must be millions of other people out there who feel the same, whether they work in bars or restaurants or nightclubs, or whether they're DJs or roadies or whatever they might be. Everyone's individual and they need a way that they can understand. So what I did is I essentially left my job in London. I retrained in mental health first aid, which is something that I'm an instructor in. So I deliver mental health first aid to workplaces. And I also chose to specialize in suicide and suicide prevention because, frankly, I've had enough of it. It's no one's ever died from suicide. You can't catch it. It's not contagious. People die by suicide. It's the outcome of often a bigger underlying problem. And the more I started to learn about suicide and do my studying, it made me realize how wrong everyone has it. People don't understand it. People don't understand what it is. And that's why we don't talk about it. And the fact that people don't talk about it really is a huge problem because it is preventable. So what I try and do as an organization is work with organizations and businesses, but not just corporate businesses, which my background was, but looking at industries such as entertainment, arts, working with nightclubs, working with people who have a demographic of staff who might not even know that certain charities or organizations exist, but are actually at the most vulnerable to being exposed to it. So there's a couple of different things that I can do, but I'll go in and either deliver a one-day session with them where I train people on the science behind suicide, if we're talking just suicide at the moment, and try and explain what actually drives somebody to having thoughts around suicide. So 1 in 20 of us will have thoughts of suicide. It's common, but people don't realize that. People don't understand that. Also, you don't need to have had a mental illness to qualify for thoughts of suicide. So you could have never experienced a mental illness ever, but still have these thoughts. So I educate people around the correct use of language. So believe it or not, the word committed is not actually the correct terminology. It hasn't been illegal in England since 1961 to take your own life. But we still have a culture of media and press, and any newspaper you pick up today or TV program that you watch on any terrestrial channel will still use the word commit, but it's not technically.
What's the right word?
So ideally now this all depends on what course you're teaching. Some would say that the correct language is attempted and completed. Others would say it's actually a verb, suicide. It's to suicide, suicided, to practice suicide behaviours. Now, whilst people aren't going to talk about it in the correct terminology, it's really important to try and remove the word committed because it does have a negative connotation to it. So I train people around this. I try and explain to them what drives somebody to have thoughts around suicide. But the most important thing for me is a thing called the Suicide Continuum, which I talk about in the video, which is a really, really important timescale, because again, we're led to believe that individuals who take their own life by suicide have done it on a snap decision, or it's come out of the blue, or that there was no signs. And actually that's not usually the case. An individual would have worked through a process of planning and preparation. They have to, it's vital that they do. And only when they've reached this point, what generally tends to happen, and I compare it to like organising a party, it's not the best analogy, but in the same way, you can't just throw a massive birthday party. You have to know who's going to be there. Is there alcohol? Is it a free bar? Is there food? What are you going to dress? Do you have a DJ? All these elements need to go in. And the planning process around suicide is really similar. You need to know all of your elements are going to be right. And what happens, and this is where we as a culture, nation, humans, I don't know how big a problem is, but this is where we get it wrong. Often when someone has planned out their suicide, they'll hit a point of euphoria, they'll relax. Like when you organise a party and you get to the bar and have your first drink, so to speak, you go, I'm relaxed, it's done. And this is often what people see, and then mistake for somebody being okay again. And we all look at it and go, oh, they're going back out with their friends, they're socialising, they just pay me back that money, this is brilliant, they're normal. And we pat ourselves on the back and say, good job was done. But this is the most vulnerable time for an individual who's thinking about taking their life, because it often means that they've completed their planning process and they're at peace. And I see it all the time with interviews, especially if celebrities have taken their life, unfortunately, and often their friends will come on and talk on the media and say, oh, we just didn't see it coming and they were the same. And it frustrates me, because the more people know about this change in behavior, the more we can be aware and alert and start to recognize it. So I educate people around this, how to spot it in their friends, how to spot it in people around them. Statistically, 95% of the time, people will give off signs or signals, either consciously or unconsciously, before they attempt to take their life. So we always hear, oh, we never saw it coming, but often that's because we choose not to acknowledge what they're saying to us to meet their needs. So I train people on how to recognize the signs and the symptoms. And finally, it's really an interesting point around the process that someone follows. Often when they hear the word suicide, they panic and they worry that they've got this huge responsibility on their shoulders that they need to do with. And I train people how to deal with that, we call it holding a hot rock, and then how to break up that rock. It's not about passing the problem on to someone else, but it's about breaking it up and getting professionals in the world of
rock being
the information, someone saying they're going to kill themselves. And often we humans are like, oh my God, you've given me this information, what am I meant to do with it? And they panic. And remembering that thoughts of suicide are common, 5% of the population, it's not unlikely that someone will say this to someone. So when you're holding this rock, I try and educate people on, well, where are your network? And we call them partnerships. Who are the professionals that you need to be aware of to say, okay, someone's given me this information, I now need to connect you with that and you with that person, and build this network of support. Because that's hugely important, hugely important, that you get the right support for people. So what I do is
which in freelance work is not always possible, because you on your own and you wouldn't have a line manager or HR. But there's also like in there.
But it's not always about being, although I train in the workplace, what I'm looking to do with these individuals is help them realize who the partner networks are in the wider community. So outside of the workplace. So whether it be the Samaritans, whether it be other organizations that support people when they're having thoughts around suicide. There's some amazing apps that exist that are brilliant. I don't know if you're happy for me to mention them, but there's apps that people can download. The best one for me is called Hub of Hope. Hub of Hope's a great one for support areas, but Stay Alive is the suicide awareness app. And I always say to people, just download it, let it go and sit in your iCloud. But the moment you need it, there's support plans on there. There's opportunities for what to do if you come into contact with someone who's having thoughts of suicide. If you're walking down the street and you see someone sat on the side of the bridge, you can literally open it and remind yourself of what you need to do. So there's great resources out there. And then simple ones, just like friends, family, neighbors, these individuals all become partnership networks to help share some of that rock. Because there's lots of myths around suicide. One of the main ones, and one of my favorites, if you like, is that people who talk about suicide don't ever go through with it. And this is a funny one for me because it's kind of true. Because often people who do talk about the fact they're having thoughts around suicide can get the help that they need.
Yeah.
And by getting the help that they need, it reduces their chances of actually attempting to take their own life. It's often the people that don't get the support and don't talk about how they're feeling that end up going ahead and completing suicide. So that myth's absolutely true. We want people to be talking about it. We want people to be engaged. We want people to have these skills to be able to support others. Because one interesting thing, and I'll mention it here if I may, people aren't trained in suicide prevention. So again, we have a thought that doctors, GPs, paramedics, ambulance workers, nurses, policemen, firemen, that they're all trained in suicide prevention. They're not. They have no training in it.
Yeah.
So we kind of put our trust in people being able to support the most vulnerable when they're at thoughts of taking their own life, but actually they're not trained in these skills either. So it's vital that we start getting as many people trained around suicide prevention and suicide intervention so that we can bring the number down.
And I want to take you back now to the beginning
Yeah.
of the story. So when you were working in the corporate world,
Yeah.
and you started searching out, so you said that there were no organizations that would speak to you. What was the point when you started searching, or did you research online? How did you, being, I would imagine, fairly successful in your career at that point, how did you start seeking for something else? When was the point when you decided, okay, now there's something wrong and I need that?
So you remember these moments crystal clear, or I certainly do anyway. So my I was living with depression, and for a long period of time I was masking it. For a number of years, I'd get up and I'd commute into London and put on this big show, which is really common for individuals with depression. The effort you need to put into pretending you don't have depression is exhausting. And I was living with my depression and anxiety, and it would start to get to the point where social events or dinner parties, the amount of ones of these I went to where I was back in my hotel by 8:30 at night because I just socially couldn't be around other people. But the moment that it really hit me was I was on a flight home from a customer meeting and I broke down in tears on the plane, literally floods of tears, and I couldn't control it. I couldn't explain it. And this was on a Thursday afternoon, and there was a woman colleague with me, and she didn't know what to say. She didn't have a clue like how to react to this man that sat next to her crying his eyes out. And when we parted, I remember she kind of just said, "Look, chin up, it'll be okay." And at that moment, I remember thinking, I can't hide this anymore. I can't continue to put on this pretense. And so I decided to work from home on the Friday. And again, you remember it crystal clear. It was a rainy day and I was sat in my lounge, and I knew my employer had an employee assistance program. I'd heard this thing spoken about. And I figured, well, what I'd do that day is find a phone number. I just knew I needed to speak to someone and try and get all of these things off of my chest. So I went onto our work portal and was searching for this phone number. And I couldn't actually find one, which was extremely frustrating. And all I could find was clinical white papers and reports and articles that clinical people had written. And I remember sitting there trying to read them, already in a state of despair, trying to make sense of what's going on in my head, and just getting more mumbled and jumbled up because all I was reading was clinical white papers. And it was at that point that I really thought, this is ridiculous. Like, I can't, if I can't understand it as an educated person, at my lowest point, this has to change. This has to change. So everything I do, I went through the process of learning, and I went through the process of white papers, and I made a promise that I'll never talk in clinical terms, and I don't. So when I train, although I know the clinical terms and I understand the clinical terms, I'm very visual. I've used my hands a lot, you see. I'm visual, but I try and paint pictures. I try and help people understand in real life situations, and to be able to close their eyes and visualize what I'm saying to them, what is happening inside their brain. Because often when we're living with a mental illness or poor mental health, it can feel like just a big black cloud.
Yeah.
And if you try and ask someone to pick apart what's in that big black cloud, they really struggle to do so. It's just an overwhelming big black cloud. So the way that I train is I try and give people tools and tips and skills so they can pick it apart and they can understand it and they can close their eyes and they can visualize what they're looking at. No clinical talk, very, very rarely, because I found that not everyone wants to talk in clinical terms.
Well, most people don't.
Yeah.
I have a question. So suicide is a problem that predominantly affects men.
Yes.
How do you find in this climate, when talking about men's issues is almost a taboo, how do you find talking about it? What's the feedback you're getting?
So
conversation.
It's an interesting one. So men outweigh women. So every day in the UK. So today, on the 3rd of September 2020, on average, 12 men will wake up this morning that won't wake up tomorrow morning. 12 men today,
right.
Maybe slightly more even at the moment, but we'll work off of the latest stats. 4 women today will wake up that won't wake up tomorrow morning. And that will happen tomorrow and the day after and the day after and the day after. So we're talking around 16 people reported a day. Men outweigh women 3-1 for various reasons. The main one being that they don't talk, they don't communicate. From the moment you're born, you're pigeoned into either being given a blue jumpsuit or a pink jumpsuit, a baby doll or an action man, and we're brought up in this way. But what I have found is this is kind of breeded by people still saying it. This men don't talk gets fueled by people continuing to say men don't talk, because as soon as I engage with a male, and if we're going to look at males for the time, as soon as I engage with a male, they'll open up. Yeah. As soon as I do that, and I think a lot of it comes down to the right use of language, how you ask the male that. So on average, we say we're fine 14 times a day. You okay? Yeah, I'm fine. It's a flippant answer. We say it all the time. So it's learning the skills to really ask the question, to look someone in the eye and say, look, I've got concerns. I've heard a few things you've said. I need to ask, are you thinking of killing yourself? Now that seems really strong, but that's the only way to ask this question. It breaks down all barriers. People skirt around. But as soon as you ask a question like that, you're giving that person permission to answer honestly. You're giving that person pure permission to say, yeah, I am. So whilst men don't talk,
yeah, that's a big answer to receive as well.
Yeah. Oh, and it's very important. I mean, we could do a whole session here, but how you take that answer is huge.
Yeah.
But men will talk if you honestly give them permission to, and that's the truth. And the only way to really give the man permission, and a female, but we're talking about male here, is a clear, direct question. Anything else will just get you a, yeah, I'm all right, it's okay.
Yeah.
The direct question.
Go on.
No, and I was going to say, and then often what you'll find is that they won't stop. The floodgates will open, and they really will bear all. Some of the biggest, nastiest brutes of men that I've known have bared all to me, because you take the time to ask the question and just say, look, I want to know. I really do want to know. So I think we need to move past this men don't talk. And again, when I do this, I'm trying to change it for my kids' generation and for my grandkids. I'm trying to allow that men don't feel the need to have to grow up in this culture where they don't talk, or where they have to put a face on, or bravado. It takes time. It's a very, very slow process. Well,
the social pressure is really plays a big role in it as well. Yeah, the expectation, what we expect from men is different to what we expect from women. So correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe the construction industry is the highest ranking for suicide rates. Is that because it's male dominated?
Well, there's a few reasons. It's not the highest. Some of the other ones. So when it comes to male suicide, so your highest age range is 40 to 49. So a male 40 to 49 is the highest risk of taking their own life. After 40 to 49, actually, it goes to 70 plus. So men in their 70s are the second highest rate, often because they might have lost a loved one or they might be living with a terminal illness. It's only then that you start to drop down to what people believe to be the risk areas, which are around those 20 to 40s. They fall further down. Construction is an interesting one. It tends to be more final fix industries. So those, once the buildings have been built, what often happens with businesses, buildings being built, if you think about it, is they overrun.
Yeah.
And they take longer and longer and longer, which means that by the time the final fix people come in, the window that they had to do their job has shrunk rapidly. Well, you had 3 weeks, but actually we've overrun, so you've only got 2 days now to deliver. And most of those people are small independent businesses that are struggling with cash flow anyway. So they feel a lot of the pinch when it comes to construction.
Yeah.
Some of the other highest industries, though, are actually doctors, dentists, and vets. And the reason for that being they have access to lethal means. Lethal means when it comes to taking your own life is extremely crucial, and it's something that people don't consider, but it's actually very, very hard to get hold of a lethal means. So they have injections that they could put into themselves and quite painlessly pass away. Tablets won't work in the same way they used to. They don't have the same chemicals in them, and you can't put the hose pipe through a car anymore because most cars have catalytic converters now. So the lethal means is a hugely important part as to why certain industries have higher rates.
That's interesting. I just completed a short film actually, and I've had to think through it was a attempted suicide, I guess, and I had to go through this suicide continuum thought process for the character, and it was then when I kind of became aware of the fact that wow, we want to think what you're wearing, you want to think who is going to find you, do you want to make it obvious that you committed suicide, or you want to make it look like an accident? There is so much that goes into it. And I would like you to tell more about those pointers that people, so apart from people changing and starting going out, which could mean that they are either recovering or they're at the end step, what else could people pay attention to while this thought process goes in their heads?
Yeah, certainly. So as I said, let me try and put this in order for you. Majority of people, a high percentage, I think it's around 80% of people who take their own life by suicide are experiencing a mental illness. So this is the first thing, and I mentioned this when I said no one dies from suicide. You can't catch it. So we'll focus on this 80% of people who are living with a mental illness. The other 20% would generally be individuals who have committed a crime that they've been exposed on and they see no other way out, or they're dying from a terminal illness and they choose to take their life. But the 80% of people who we're going to look at here will be living with a mental illness. So let's say they're living with severe depression. The severe depression that they're experiencing will be completely overwhelming. So naturally, they'll be showing certain symptoms of depression. When you're trying to plan how you're going to kill yourself, this takes weeks, months, years of really, really being able to try to understand. So whilst on the outside, we'll see an individual, in the inside, that'll be all they'll be thinking about. They'll be running through scenarios constantly in their head, which is hugely overwhelming. So by nature, they're going to be exhausted. They're going to be deflated. So these changes in behaviors are really, really key, not just to see if they're living with a mental illness, but where they are. As I said a moment ago, 95% of people consciously or unconsciously give off signs that they are doing, that they're having thoughts of suicide. This is really important because people say all the time, there was no signs. There is, just we choose not to see them. So this can be from things that they say, I just can't do this anymore. I don't want to be here anymore. Everyone will be better off without me. We hear this a lot. And because we're scared, we often dismiss it or go, oh, don't be silly, you'll be okay.
Yeah.
That is a clear indicator that someone is giving, if it is part of a bigger picture. They might start to change their appearance. Now, what's really key is not everyone who dresses disheveled has a mental illness and wants to take their own lives. Some people dress disheveled and actually like that style. So we're looking for changes. We're looking for things people say and the way they behave. Have they become withdrawn? Are they starting to isolate themselves? Are they starting to say strange things or purchase strange things? Are you starting to notice things on websites or search histories that don't make much sense? There's some horrible, horrible websites that exist, pro-suicide websites, where people will happily provide suggestions for how people can take their own lives. It's disgusting, it's terrible. But as I said, it's not as easy to take your own life as you think. So often people need to research what they're going to do. So if you ever notice anything like this, it needs to be taken very, very, very seriously. People might start, like I said, spending money that they don't have. When actually they haven't got to worry about paying it back because their plan is that they won't be here. They might start buying gifts for people. They might start, like I said, re-engaging with friends, sorting out their funeral, sorting out, if I'm not around anymore, would you be happy to have my dog? Things like this. These are all signs. That's why when you start putting all of these together, you can see why 95% of the time people will give off some form of sign, consciously or subconsciously. It's down to the individuals around them who hopefully can get trained to start going, okay, I'm recognizing these signs now.
Yeah.
So yeah, there's lots and lots of different ones, but it's about having been observant. One of the other key things I try and train is confidence, which sounds silly, but I try and instill in people confidence to ask the next question, to not be afraid to find out more, to dig a bit deeper, to say, well, hang on, let me know, tell me what's going on here. TED Talks. So people often watch TED Talks and they don't know what TED stands for. So tell me about, explain, describe. These are some of the best ways to engage with somebody, whether they're experiencing a mental illness or thinking of taking their own life.
Mm-hmm.
Tell me about that. Explain that to me. Explain how you're feeling. Describe what that must feel like to me. These are massively powerful questions. So by giving people the confidence to ask these, and then the skills of how to handle the answers is key. Really, really key.
That's interesting. And speaking of work environment, so
Yeah.
that question is there any difference in position? So would there be more suicides the higher you go up the ladder, or it's not related, or the lower you are?
No, and this is another key thing. Your main split is male to female. For people who want to know more about statistics, the Office of National Statistics have just released the latest dates, and I'll come back to a point on this in a moment if that's okay. But these statistics will break down region, age range, and the whole aspect of it. But in terms of position, or CEO versus the cleaner, no. What drives suicide is three factors: psychological, behavioral, and past history. Okay, so so am I a man? Was I brought up in care? Do I live with a mental illness? My past history. These are the factors that drive something. But then we all have a life buffer. We all have relationships, homes, money, kids, holidays, cars. These are what are known as your life buffer. What can happen is if COVID strikes, people's buffers start to shrink. They get chipped away at. And as your buffer shrinks, if you have the correct factors behind that, they'll start to penetrate through your buffer. And that's when people go on to have thoughts of suicide. So very much in the same way where you and I could be exactly the same, we could experience exactly the same effects of COVID or losing our jobs, yet one of us could be susceptible to suicidal thoughts and one won't. And that's the difference. That's why some people will go on to attempt to take their lives and others don't. For some people, suicide's never an option. For others, it is. So it doesn't matter what job you do or what existence you have in that sense.
Go on, sorry.
I was going to say, sorry, something that I made a video about recently, because this is really, really important. During COVID, I started to get tagged into a lot of posts around people saying that suicide's gone up 200% during COVID. And I started to look at that. Now, as this is an industry that I specialize in, it intrigued me. And I thought, I haven't seen that report that says that. And I started to ask people, where is this report? And no one could show it to me. And it got me motivated enough to do a video, because it's so important that when we talk about a subject as sensitive as suicide, we must use correct facts.
Yeah.
Now, to suggest that it had gone up by 200% would mean that 49 people a day during COVID were taking their lives. That's a huge number to go from 16 to 49. That's huge. And even if that was the case, there's just no stats to suggest it. So a coroner has to give a verdict of suicide. The only way a death can be recorded as suicide is when a coroner gives that verdict. Due to the complexities of a suicide, often a coroner can take anywhere from a couple of months to 2 years to give that verdict. So to say that we have a 200% increase in a 6-month period is not possible. The Office of National Statistics only yesterday released the 2019 figures.
Okay.
So it's really important that when people talk about such a worthy cause, such as suicide, we use facts and right figures. The Samaritans have a brilliant bit on their website for all journalists and media to use, the guidelines to make sure that we're using correct stats and terminology. But really important, really, really key.
Yeah.
Right, I just wanted to get that in there.
So I guess you mentioned that there are, I put it in my own words, certain coping skills that one person might have and the other might lack, and that would potentially lead to suicide attempt. Any tips, any advice on what are the coping skills, or where to learn them or gain them, or how to learn and gain them?
Yeah, so it's not so much the coping, well, these biological, sociological factors that we have are embedded in us as young individuals. They're part of who we are.
Yeah.
And that's why it's so important that we have a nice thick buffer. So if we are susceptible to these factors, we want a nice thick life buffer. So not everyone who was brought up in a children's home will go on to take their own lives. But some people who don't have a nice chunky buffer, these past experiences can pull through. So the key thing is to have a good understanding around mental health. So alongside suicide, I train mental health training and awareness. And this is key, to understand what mental health is, to understand what the difference between mental health and mental illness. You'd be surprised at how many people don't understand the difference between the two. But to build good resilience, so then you're looking at training mental health skills as well and understanding those. The more you can understand that you might be susceptible to suicide and that it's common and not something to be afraid of, the quicker you can get to a point where you're able to discuss those thoughts openly. Imagine being a young teenager who's susceptible to these thoughts in a world where no one talks about suicide, and you're sat at home thinking, oh God, I'm having these thoughts. What do I do with these thoughts? Are these normal thoughts? Am I meant to act on these thoughts?
Yeah.
Until we get to a place in culture where it's openly discussed, that's the only point at which the people who are susceptible feel confident to really talk.